Today, we're going to do part 2 of my Castlevania series review, and we're going to go back and look at the original 3 games in the series. Let's ignore the arcade game Haunted Castle, and of course Castlevania, The Adventure on Game Boy. We have a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. The original Castlevania was released in North America in 1986, and it was one of the first horror-themed NES games that I remember playing. I just love the box art for this. Dracula looks menacing as hell, and Simon, yeah, just look at that ass. The back of this box scared the shit out of a young me. When you finally call up enough courage to start the game, you'll know shit's about to get real. Is there a more iconic opening in video game history? Right off the bat, pun intended, we're greeted with maybe the best music track of the 8-bit generation, Vampire Killer. A rendition of this theme can be found in almost every Castlevania game since. Music is going to be a big theme in this review. Starting out, Castlevania is a pretty standard platformer. You jump around, kill enemies with your whip, and find cool new items to help vanquish evil. Except for the dagger, it's nearly useless. This is the opposite of Get the Knife from Ghosts and Goblins. The second level is where I used to have troubles with as a kid. This stage introduces the annoying one-hit kill stage hazards, as well as the ever-famous flying Medusa heads. When the hell did they get the idea to have flying Medusa heads anyway? The boss here is Medusa herself. Sort of. It's just her decapitated head. This is by far the easiest boss in the game. Stage 3. Actually, let's pause here for a second and address the elephant in the room. I know it really says Stage 7 on the top right corner, but they count each new screen as a new stage. It's really weird, and I don't know of any other game that does this off the top of my head. This stage introduces the ever-annoying hunchbacks. I always thought these were just angry monkeys. I just don't see a hunchback when you look at it. You have to kill these things right when they land, otherwise they jump in extremely random patterns, and it's a real pain in the ass to deal with. Later in the level is one of the more frustrating portions in the game. These ravens will fly down and try to knock you into the pits. The pattern is a real bitch to figure out. The end boss of stage 3 is the mummy. Well, at least 2 of them. They can be fairly hard to kill if you don't have the boomerang. Stage 4 throws you deep into Dracula's asshole. These bats will fly at you from whatever direction you're facing, so look back as much as possible to easily deal with their annoying spawn patterns. You also should try your hardest to grab the firebomb in this area. And you might be asking why I just called this the firebomb. Well, read the damn manual. It's not holy water. Yet. While it's not 100% necessary to have the firebomb, it helps a ton with the last boss of the stage. The boss is Frankenstein, and he has an invincible Igor with him, who looks just like a hunchback. The firebomb freezes enemies in place while also doing damage. If you don't have it here, Igor will push your shit in harder than Vince tries to get Roman over. Stage 5 starts out easy enough, but like the last level, be sure to grab the firebomb here. If you don't, the boss will be nearly impossible. The end screen of the stage is pretty daunting, but it's easier than it looks. There are 3 axemen to defeat, and they're all surrounded by a steady stream of Medusa heads. If you still have the firebombs, all it takes is 1 to kill the axemen, and while it's dealing damage, it also takes away the damage that they deal from you. You can hop right through them. Without the firebombs, it's still not that hard, but requires some precision whipping and jumping to get through. The boss here is the holy mother of Nintendo rage quits, the Grim Reaper himself. Again, if you have the firebomb, this fight is easy, but if you don't, well, just look at this hell. Good luck. So now we're on to the final stretch, and the only thing between you and Dracula is a bunch of giant bats and a clock tower full of hunchbacks. Patience pays off here. The level is hard as hell, but thankfully it's short. Once you get to the final staircase, and you'll be seeing this a lot, the game graciously gives you a final checkpoint. Dracula himself can feel like he's impossible at first until you figure out his pattern. If you jump and whip as soon as he shoots his fireballs, you'll never get hit. After you deplete his health bar, Dracula shows his true form, and it's a giant, evil grimace monster? Like every other boss, he's easily defeated with a firebomb and whip. The end credits are somewhat of an oddity. Instead of the typical developer credits, There's a lot of wordplay for the famous actors and directors of the original Dracula films. Do you get it? Christopher B! The original Castlevania is one of my favorite games on the NES. The music is incredible, and the gameplay is tight. The stages are well designed, and the difficulty is very high. It might not be up there in the same difficulty as Ninja Turtles or Battletoads, but it's right on that next tier where only the hardened NES veterans are going to be able to stick through until the end. This is one of my 5 out of 5 games for Nintendo, and it's a bona fide classic. Up next is one of the more controversial games in the NES library, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. For years, likely due to AVGN and due to the overly cryptic nature of the game, Nintendo fans hated Simon's Quest. I had somehow avoided playing this game until very recently, and I guess I'm on the other side of the fence. Returning to action is Simon Belmont, and he apparently is carrying a curse of Dracula. In order to break the curse, you must find the 5 pieces of Dracula's body spread throughout the land and burn them in his castle. Right away, you'll notice this game has a lot of RPG elements thrown in. You can collect hearts to buy items, like new weapons, orbs, and other power-ups. You can also level up after either collecting a certain number of hearts or killing enough enemies. I'm not exactly sure what causes it. Let's get most of the prominent complaints out of the way first. One of the big complaints people have for this game is that it changes from night to day every few minutes. When it does this, there's about a 10-second stop in action to display the slow dialogue box. Honestly though, I didn't have much of a problem with this. I think it's just over-exaggerated. When it turns into night, the monsters get much harder to deal with, and the townspeople go into hiding. You can best use this time to grind out some currency. Another annoying thing about this game is the false platforms. You can usually tell when they're coming, but to be safe, you can toss around some holy water to find out where they are. Basically, if you find yourself in a dead end, just toss some holy water around to find a hidden passage. There are a lot of cryptic areas in the game, but if you talk to every townsperson and just take a few notes, they're not really that hard to figure out. The only time I had to pull out Nintendo Power was when I thought I had reached the end of the map, but what I didn't realize is that you can walk just right out of the first town to the left. If I had played this as a kid, I think I would have had a lot more issues with the cryptic nature. But a game like Zelda 1 was also pretty hard to figure out at times. I didn't have too many problems with beating it. The last real complaint that I have is that all the bosses are pathetically easy. It's actually hard to take damage from them. They all drop a special item when they're defeated, but if you don't care, you can literally walk just right past them. Seems like a pretty big oversight. Almost like Konami just got bored and cranked the game out as early as they could. So with all of that out of the way, let's focus on the good aspects of Simon's Quest. First and foremost, this has some of the catchiest tunes in video game history. Bloody Tears is just so fucking awesome. Among all else, I just found this to be incredibly fun. Even if I couldn't tell what the hell most of the items actually did, once I started playing Simon's Quest, I had a really hard time stopping. There are just so many things to do, there's never really a dull point in the action. I've heard some people compare this to a really crude and early version of Symphony of the Night, and well, yeah, it kind of feels just like that. Simon's Quest is a solid game in my opinion, even if the ending and the bosses feel kind of rushed. I'll give this a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's nowhere near perfect, but the music alone makes it worth playing through at least once. To cap us off with the NES Castlevania games comes Castlevania 3: Draculas Curse. Is it weird to be nostalgic as hell for music you may have never heard of growing up? That's how I feel as soon as we boot up Castlevania 3. Castlevania 3 is one of the earliest games in the Castlevania timeline, and the first appearance of Dracula in Castlevania canon as far as I know. Castlevania 3 is very much the spiritual successor of the original. Gone are the RPG elements of Castlevania 2. There are a few improvements, however, from the original. Instead of a completely linear game, you can now pick your own path after levels. This game follows Trevor Belmont, and along your journey, you can rescue allies that you can switch with during gameplay using the select button. Unfortunately, only one ally can follow you around at a time, so if you collect multiple, then one will have to go away. Each ally has a special skill that makes certain parts of the games trivial. Grant can climb walls like he's Spider-Man, but he has a short little knife for an attack. Sypha, who is Trevor's future wife, or husband, is a magic user who also has a really short attack, but can toss fire or freeze her enemies. The freezing spell comes in very useful in parts, and she can one-shot any frozen enemy. You can also use the frozen enemies as platforms if you wish. She can gain access to an incredibly powerful lightning skill as well, but I was too noob to find it. Alucard is the last ally, and his skill is basically cheat mode. He can turn into a bat and skip several annoying parts of the game. He cannot use items though, and his normal attack is almost useless. You'll notice several great things about Castlevania 3 right away. The music for one is just as good as the previous games, and it sets a tone you'll only find in this trilogy. The graphics are also very nicely detailed. This is one of those games that shows off how great the NES could be at the time. Everything is extremely detailed, and some stages even have smooth animation effects that you'd rarely see on this console. The controls, however, are just as stiff as the other two games, but that's just Castlevania for you. Much like the original, this game is also hard as balls, and one of the games that comes to mind when you say Nintendo hard. I dare say that Castlevania 3 is one of the most frustrating good Nintendo games I have ever played. The developers put so many things in the game just to fuck with you. There are a lot of enemies with seemingly random patterns that feel impossible at times to avoid. Everything does so much damage too, and these birds are annoying as shit. Sometimes it seems like they are just meant to hit you, and these flying gargoyles can suck my butthole. These bastards are impossible to hit, and they always trap you on the stairs. Let's talk about the stairs. They are the most difficult part of this game. Often you'll be trapped on them while facing an annoying enemy. Like, fuck! Sometimes you can literally just fail getting on the damn things. How does that even make sense? Have you ever been getting on a flight of stairs and just fell through the damn floor instead? It's a real pain in the ass. There are also two separate sections packed full of bone towers and flying gargoyles. It's incredibly hard to get through these sections without at least taking a couple hits. I also have a problem with the rooms where the ceiling is apparently collapsing. I think some visual aid would have helped in these sections. Like, just take a look. You can die by getting too high in the screen, but what's dangerous up there? They could have at least put some spikes or something on the ceiling. Luckily, the bosses are pretty easy outside of the last three. There are some lazy design choices here, and you'll encounter some of the same bosses from earlier in the game later on. Most of them have a pretty easy pattern to figure out, and you can burst through a good amount of them with just the holy water. And of course, Death makes his usual appearance here, and he's quite frustrating to deal with. I recommend finding the axe, sitting in this corner, and unloading hell onto him. He has two forms, but luckily they're not too complicated. The doppelganger is the hardest to get a feel for. The worst part of all is that the level leading up to him is the most difficult in the game. It's incredibly long and full of various traps and annoying enemies. When and if you do finally get to the doppelganger, you're usually pretty low in health. He takes the form of whatever character you have, and spams moves and attacks at you. It took me a while, but I found that when you change characters in the middle of the fight, so does the doppelganger, so you can trick him into changing forms while you move on to safer platforms and potshot him until the end. This fight takes a lot of time and patience. The final level of this game is nice and short, definitely easier than the last level of the first Castlevania game. There is another section with the annoying falling ceiling, and it's filled with flying Medusa heads. If you're patient and hang out at the top of the level, Then you can despawn the Medusa heads, which comes in pretty handy. There are a couple of other annoying parts before Dracula, but you can skip them if you went with Alucard earlier in the game. Finally, we make it to the classic Dracula staircase, and be warned, you can totally just miss the stairs if you're not being careful. Dracula himself has a whopping 3 different forms in this game. The first form can be pretty tricky. He'll trap you in a ring of fire, and wherever you're standing after a couple of seconds, another pillar will form. If you're standing still during the very first part, then you'll have nowhere to move to. Other than that, it's not too hard, just keep moving and hitting him in the head, and then you're golden. His second form is pretty easy. He's just a weird flying monstrosity puking diarrhea out of several mouths. Not sure if this is part of Dracula's lore, or just the whims of the game's art director. All you have to do is hammer away at each face until it dies. Afterwards is the third form, and now I'm just confused. What the hell is all of this? His third form is a demonic statue that moves around some platforms and has laser eyes. That's cool and all, but what the hell does this have to do with Dracula? This last form is a real pain in the ass, but here's a hint though. Remember that staircase leading up to Dracula? Well, you can grab an axe in the room leading up to it. After getting the axe, you can go up and down the staircase until your heart's content. Punnerino intended. Every form of Dracula is much easier when you have 60 axes to hurl at his ass. Hearing Dracula scream after throwing that final axe is like lifting a year's worth of frustrating gaming experience off your shoulders. I got the same satisfaction for beating this as I had after getting through Ninja Gaiden and Ninja Turtles. Enjoy the long ending, you deserve it for getting this far. And if you want even more out of Castlevania 3, stick around until after the credits, and now you can play it on hard mode. I'll leave that up to somebody else. So to give you my final review of Castlevania 3, it's kinda hard to do. On one hand, it's everything you want from a Nintendo game. It has beautiful music, some of the best graphics on NES, and it introduced new things to the Castlevania series like branching paths and switchable allies. That's all pretty damn cool. On the other hand, the difficulty is unmercifully hard, and there are so many gotcha designs in this game. There are just too many enemies with random annoying patterns, and they all do way too much damage. This led to a lot of my experience to be frustrating more than entertaining. However, just because it's hard as hell, doesn't mean it's bad. As far as NES goes, this is about as much as a game could do on the console. For me, I'll give this game a very solid 4.5 out of 5 stars. I'm sure if I spent more time with it, perfecting the gameplay, I could probably give it a 5 one day. So that actually concludes part 2 of the Castlevania Anthology review. However, there are still more Castlevania games to play. I haven't even touched the PlayStation or the Nintendo 64 Castlevania games. There are even quite a few in Game Boy and PS2. There are just so many to do, so look forward to part 3 and probably part 4, maybe even part 5 in the future. Thanks for watching.